What's going on? It's time for another episode of Too Hard for the Radio, transmitting from the future free state of Greater Idaho. I am the one armed madman. And with me today, we've got Paul Munson. Paul, how we doing? It's good to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And it's actually Paul Musson
Musson, sorry, man. The thing
rather
is
than
pretty
the
small and my eyes aren't as great as they used to be. And I
yeah,
was running
you're not
late,
the first
so
one.
I didn't
I've
look
been called
online first. So my bad.
been
Sorry
called
about that.
yeah, I've been
Uh-oh. I just lost you there for some reason. I can't hear.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, it was my fault. It was my for some reason my mic cut out. We should be
Oh,
good to go now. So anyways, we'll just keep rolling. No big deal.
okay. Yeah,
Uh
sure.
so you had a good joke before we got on. I said it's a good time we did this with interest rates just dropping. And you said, a good time would have been any time in the past 15 years. So
Yeah, no, exactly.
so what are your thoughts on the interest rate drop?
Well, I try not to get too involved in sort of day-to-day decisions. The issues are much broader, but I will comment on it because you asked. The First of all, I don't think central banks should be manipulating interest rates. I think they should be determined by market forces. But the Federal Reserve, like it or not, has a mandate. Well, they call it a dual mandate, but it seems to be a triple mandate. But it's stable prices, high employment, and lower interest rates. And so they're acting within, I believe that's the three, but they're acting within their mandate, which was sort of established by Congress, which could be taken away at any time by Congress.
Mhm.
And so if they see the economy slowing, um, jobs coming harder to come or getting harder to come by, we have seen that inflation ticking up a little bit, job vacancies are going down. But by, any sort of measure, the economy is still very strong. Although some people think the actual recession started about a year ago, based on all these job revisions. The job numbers get revised down. So they were recently revised down by over 900,000 jobs. So the total amount of jobs produced from March of 24 to March of 25 was, or, or, or obtained in economy were much lower than originally thought. Anyways, so the Fed will look at, okay, weakening jobs environment. So we should lower interest rates so we can make debt more affordable so people can go out and spend, and that would be good for the economy. It really is fallacious economic doctrine, and which we'll talk about. But they're doing it when inflation is still above their target, which is 2%. And they shouldn't even have a 2% target. There should be no target for inflation. They should stop increasing the money supply and then let market forces dictate what prices are.
Yeah, it's
Anyway, we can get into all that if you're interested.
oh, absolutely. This is I love this type of stuff. I didn't really get into economics and stuff like this until I was about 30, but since then I've been kind of a nerd into this stuff. It's
Well,
so
good for you.
interesting and
Good for you.
the Fed is so messed up. Like as my buddy likes to say, it's not federal and it's not a reserve. And
But, yeah.
can you imagine just being some unsuspecting person in some country across the world and all of a sudden your prices go up in your local store one day and they're like, what the hell happened? Like, this tube of toothpaste was a dollar yesterday and it's $1.25 today. What happened? And it's like, oh well, some guy in America made a decision and now the entire world's prices are going up, and the
Yeah.
Federal Reserve, they've got what is it, a board of 12, I think it is, and they essentially decide monetary policy for the entire world.
Yeah. Yeah. No, no, exactly. And there's, no, as I said, it is their mandate. And so with them being on the board, we shouldn't be surprised at the decisions that they make. The issue is that it should not be there in the first place. Now, there's a lot of people who say they want to end the Fed and stuff like that. And I understand why they want to do that. You could not do that overnight. The starting point matters. And I wouldn't really want to end the Fed. I would just want the Fed to be more responsible, or have Congress change the Fed's mandate. And and as I've said many times, I don't believe that any of these people working for the Federal Reserve are evil. I don't believe it's a conspiracy theory where they actually set out to enrich the top 1% at the expense of everybody else. That's what's happened because of their actions, but they look simply at the immediate cause and effect of their actions. So we do this, we print money, stock markets go higher. And then they don't think of the second or third order consequences that are 2, 3, 5, 10 years down the road, where everybody is now suffering from those actions. Not everybody, the bottom 50% in particular, are suffering the consequences of those actions of distorting interest rates lower to drive asset prices higher.
Yep.
And so they have sacrificed, unwittingly, I would say, they've sacrificed the main economy for the average Joe on the altar of higher asset prices, which the top 10% own most of.
Yep.
So it's benefited a very small percentage of the population. And that small percentage of the population, they're not evil either. They haven't done anything wrong. They played by all the rules. All of a sudden, you see their stock market portfolio go up. The shares in their business, if they have gone through the roof. And it's human nature that you would put your soaring stock price down to your own brilliance and your ability. People are finally recognizing me for who I am and how
Yeah.
great I am. No, you just got lucky that the central bank changed the way they did things and started targeting asset prices, particularly in 2001 in the wake of the dot-com crash.
Yeah, my grandfather was one of those secret geniuses, right? That got rich early in the stock market. Well, not early, like for him, kind of fairly early in his life, but
Yeah,
he got lucky. He
yeah,
wasn't doing anything special. He was watching Jim Cramer on TV during the day. You know what I mean? And he
yeah,
lost everything in 2001, and then started listening to Cramer again. Lost
yeah.
everything in 2008, and you know it's sorry, my dog is just being out of control, and, there's a couple problems with, like, the bottom, like you said, 50%, even more of people who get really screwed by these economic policies, and one of them is that they can't save enough money to buy assets, like, they're
Yeah.
living paycheck to paycheck, so they couldn't, you know, buy assets if they wanted to, and the second is economic illiteracy, and I'm not sure that, like, economic illiteracy in this country is a mistake. Like, I didn't learn anything about economics while I was in high school. We
Mhm.
didn't have any economic classes. Like, there was absolutely nothing about it. Like, it wasn't like I was taught economics wrong. I wasn't taught it at all.
Yes,
And, in college wasn't much better. I went to college a couple years ago as like retraining after I lost my hand, and they put me in a business, in a business program, like to get a business degree. And I remember in my macroeconomics class, I'm reading the section on the business cycle, which is about this long, you know,
Mhm.
and essentially it goes like, this is what the business cycle is. It's a boom bust cycle. It happens every so many years and blah blah blah. It doesn't say why it happens. It doesn't say, what decisions leads the business cycle to do what it does. It just says this is what it is and it's inevitable essentially and just move on and accept it as doctrine. It's
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
man, if that's what you're getting in college level economics, like we are really screwed.
Well, they always put it down to animal spirits, and
Yeah.
it's put forward by John Maynard Keynes. And but yeah, no, I mean I have a quote in my book, and I wrote my book precisely for what you were just talking about to improve economic literacy, sort of democratize, if you will, economics. And I have a quote in my book by John Kenneth Galbraith, and he was sort of a left leaning economist. But even he said that in talking about the concept of money, that it is the way they talk about it is to deliberately keep people in the dark. And money is a more complicated issue than you think. And I have three chapters in my book, which is called Capital Offense: Why Some Benefit at Your Expense. And I have three chapters on money, explaining exactly what it is. And that is one of the main issues in society today, and one of the main reasons that politicians behave the way they do in terms of spending and debt, because they don't fully understand the concept of money. And they get tricked, if you will, or swayed by certain economists who are more ideologically driven than truth or economic law driven. And
Paul
so the
Krugman.
laws of economics are just what they are, but they can often be very inconvenient. And so if someone has a strong ideology, which means they just want to print money and hand it out, and everybody's going to be happy and rainbows and buttercups as far as the eye can see, then they don't like hearing that, well, if you do this, it's going to end up being really bad for everybody. Initially, it looked like it's working and everything is fine, but longer term, it won't be. And so they don't like those laws, so they come up with their own laws. And some economists have likened it to blaming gravity for plane crashes. Well, you can't get angry at gravity for a plane crash. It's just the law of gravity. It is what it is. So, what do we do about it? How do we deal with gravity? It's the same thing with economics. And so, the whole point of my book is to empower people. I think the average person is very smart, particularly when it comes down to what to do with their own hard earned capital. They don't need policymakers telling them how much they should spend and how much they should save. They don't need policymakers telling them how much they should pay for their house or that stocks are not overpriced or underpriced. That's for people with their own capital to determine. And so, by empowering people with knowledge and understanding about how things really work, then people are in place to demand better decision making from our policymakers, from our leaders. We can vote the people in who will then do the right thing. And even those in charge today are not bad people. They're doing what we demand of them. For the last 30, 40 years, we've been demanding this. We want more, give us more, because we don't believe that there are any long-term consequences to it, as long as we get our pound of flesh. But it always comes at somebody else's expense. And I have two chapters on governments in my book, explaining, what they are and what they're not. And governments do not produce any capital. So when governments send out social security checks or Medicare or whatever, food stamps, all that capital that they're sending out comes from the private sector. Capital is only produced in the private sector. The government gets its hands on capital from the private sector in one of three ways. So first, obviously, they can tax you. So they tax if you're making a lot of money. Here in Canada, at the top end, you're over half of your capital is taken from you at the top marginal rate. The other way the government gets your capital is by borrowing. So you can voluntarily lend your capital to the government and they will pay you back in the future. The only way they can pay you back in the future is by taxing somebody else in the future, because when they take your capital, you lend it to them. They don't put it to productive use to create more capital. It's consumed, which we can talk about as well. So, first way is taxation, they get your capital. You can lend your capital to them. That's the second way. The third way they get their hands on capital is by printing money. And they're able to do this because money and capital are two different things. So, let me just explain the difference between these two because it's
Yeah,
very
go ahead.
important. So, capital is anything that people produce, a good or a service. So, your podcast, you're producing capital that your listeners consume. So the example I like to give is that let's say you make bikes. So you create a bike, and let's say it's a really nice bike, it's worth like $1,000. So you create a bike, you've just created capital. Let's say I make suits. I've just created a suit, I've created capital. So you created a bike, I created a suit. There's that much more capital now in society. And importantly, it didn't come at anybody else's expense. It wasn't a net zero sum game. So you don't have a bike because somebody else has one bike less. No, you created that capital. Hard work, ingenuity. Okay, so you've got your capital, I got my capital. If there was no money, we would do what's called a direct exchange, which is barter, like a barter type of economy, where you would give me your bike, I'd give you my suit. And now we're both happy. It was a fair exchange, voluntary, didn't come at anybody else's expense. But we can't have a large economy with barter. It's just too complicated. And again, I talk about this in my book. So we have money. Money is the medium of exchange. Money is what we use to exchange all the capital that everybody is producing in the economy. So you produce your bike, you sell it for $1,000. I produce my suit, I sell it for $1,000. Now you use your $1,000 to go buy something, and you might buy my suit from me with the money. So that's indirect exchange. You created a bike. That was that gave you the wherewithal to go out and buy something else. You could only go and buy something because you created capital, right? The means of payment is the bike that you produced. So this is all fine and dandy. So let's say you make 10 bikes and you sell them for $1,000 each. So now you've got $10,000 sitting in your bank account. What that $10,000 represents effectively is the 10 bikes that you created. So you're temporarily storing your 10 bikes that you created in the money in your bank account. Okay. So now let's say the central bank, Federal Reserve, let's say they double the money supply before you get a chance to spend your $10,000 in your bank account. When a central bank prints money out of thin air, it does just that. It doesn't create capital to obtain that money. It just prints it out of thin air. So that new money has no capital stored up in it. It obtains capital as soon as it comes into circulation by extracting capital from the rest of the money already in existence. So when it doubles the money supply, the government spends it, it takes half of the bikes from your $10,000. So on your bank statement, it still says you got 10,000 bucks in your account, so you think you're doing okay. Well, no, you're not, because now your $10,000, instead of storing 10 bikes, it only stores 5 bikes. And as the bikes were your means of payment, that's what gave you the wherewithal to spend. You've only got 5 bikes to spend now instead of 10. So that $10,000 will only buy half as much as it would have done before the central bank doubled the money supply. That's how the government obtains capital from the private sector, apart from taxation and borrowing, is by printing money.
Yep, and your purchasing power just keeps dropping and dropping and dropping until you
Exactly.
can no longer afford to build bikes on your own, and you have to go take a job working for somebody else, working for a big
Exactly.
company. Like, so my co-host on the podcast is a Harley Davidson mechanic. He works for a
Okay.
Harley Davidson dealership. It's a good job, but it's not a great job, right? And he would love to build bikes on his own, but without going into his life story, A, he can't afford to, open up his own shop. That's a problem. He can't even
Yep.
afford to buy the parts to build the bikes. And as you said, as the money supply keeps increasing at an accelerating rate, like we're never going to go back to pre-COVID spending. It's just not going to happen. They're going to spend more and more each year as they continue to do. It's becoming more and more unattainable. You would think the general idea of working for somebody is I'm going to save my money, and each year that I save it's going to be easier and easier to open up my own shop and start to build my own bikes. But it's actually the opposite, because the money
Mhm.
as the money supply increases, the purchasing power of those dollars that you're saving is diminished, and it keeps you from being able to buy the parts to even open up the shop. And then, if you're lucky enough to get that thing going, your your purchasing power is diminished as you're building, and each bike that you build, you make less and less profit on each year,
Yeah.
which is again a non-intuitive way to think about things because it's like as you build, you should get better. And as you build better bikes, you should be able to ask more money for them, which is true. Both things can exist at once. But
Yep.
your skill is not going to increase as fast as the money supply.
Yeah. No, and it's really hard on so many people, and it's people who, I kind of joke around, but only half joke that I think all politicians, before they're allowed to be in office, should have to have attempted to start a business
Yeah, I
and
agree.
see what it's like. Never mind fighting inflation, but all the regulatory red tape bureaucracy you've got to go through, and then see what it's like to truly compete and win the what they call the sovereign consumer. The consumer decides your fate because if they don't like whatever customer value proposition you're offering, then you're screwed. But that's your fault. It's not their fault, right? So it's really competitive and it's a beautiful thing. You have entrepreneurs out there all reinvesting in their business. And in your case, maybe it's bikes, and or your buddy's case, how can I make better bikes? How can I thrill my clients or my customers? And then they willingly part with their capital to buy your buddy's capital, which is a bike. And again, doesn't come at anybody's expense. But that's like a lifelong commitment. And you do it because you love it, right? You love making bikes, you love thrilling your customer. You don't need, central banks working against you in all of
Yeah.
that because it's tough enough as it is. And actually, in the acknowledgement section of my book, I talk about my family and stuff like that, and a few economists who really help me understand things. But I also talk about entrepreneurs, and I name about 4 or 5 of them. One is a bakery, one's a butcher shop, one's a bike shop, one's a clock shop. Hardworking people who provide a real, true, honest customer value proposition. It's just such a pleasure to buy things from these people, and because they just love what they do and they're
Yep.
adding to society, you know?
Yep. And, all things equal, prices should fall to the marginal cost of production. So as it becomes easier to produce parts, like what the first dirt bike that I bought was $5,000 for a brand new dirt bike. That was in the early 2000s. It was a 125 two-stroke. It's a fairly easy bike to build. Those bikes should be getting cheaper over time. Now, that same bike with very little improvements done to it is about $8,000. And that shouldn't make sense, right? Like, so one of the areas that always promised better technology and cheaper prices was like making movies, right? All right, as technology gets better, CGI will get cheaper. It's going to be faster and easier for people to produce it, and it'll cost less to make movies. But as with everything else, it's costing more and more and more to make movies every year. It's costing more and more and more to make bikes every year, which
Mm.
shouldn't happen in a truly free market. Like these things should be getting cheaper over time because it should be cheaper, easier, faster for the companies building these things to be able to actually build them. So, why don't you talk a bit about prices?
Yeah, so that's a really good observation, Nick. And it's another subject I talk about in my book that rather than see, central banks have convinced everybody that you need around 2% inflation for the economy to grow. It's nonsense. There should be deflation, slow,
Yep.
steady deflation that results from productivity improvements in the economy. So, just for your listeners, the way it works, or supposed to work, is that so let's say it's your buddy's making bikes, and he's making the same bike, but over time he's coming up with more efficient ways of making them, saving him time. And so or there's new parts that cost a little bit less or whatever without compromising on quality. And so he finds that his profit margin starts to widen. He's making more money. So let's say his bikes, I don't know how much a bike, let's say 10,000 bucks or
Yeah.
whatever. So he's still selling at 10,000, but his costs have gone down. So his profit is growing up, is going up. So competitors see that. And so they enter your buddy's industry and start making similar bikes. And to win over those customers, instead of $10,000, they may charge 9,000. So now your buddy has to lower his price from 10,000 down to 9,000. And now he's still making money. He's back to what he was making before, but he wasn't making that excess profitability. And now the competing companies, they reinvest in their production techniques and make the bike a little bit cheaper, lower their price. Now your buddy has to respond by reinvesting in more productivity techniques or whatever. And so over time, the price of the bike should be slowly falling. It's called good deflation. And so we should be having good deflation of 1, 2% per year, maybe in the economy. And so even for somebody who is on a flat wage, their wages are not growing every year. Every year, they're getting wealthier because prices generally are slowly falling. And this is exactly what happened in the US in the 30-year period from 1867 to 1897. So, more or less the last 30 years of the 19th century, where you did have money supply growth, but it was a lot slower than it is today, something like 4.5% per year, roughly. But you had an explosion in productivity. The economy was booming. So money was growing at 4.5, let's say, but productivity was growing at 5, 6%. And so prices necessarily were coming down, not every year, but on the whole, were coming down. And that's the way it's supposed to work. But central banks have convinced politicians that they need inflation for the economy to work. It's nonsense. And they claim that if there was deflation, that the whole economy would grind to a halt. And the reason they say that, because if there were falling prices, they would argue that people would save their money rather than spend it because they could buy stuff a year later at a cheaper price. It's complete nonsense. And so I use a specific example in my book. And so let's say there's 2% deflation. So prices are falling 2% per year. Central banker would tell you consumer spending will dry up because everyone's going to wait a year to save 2%. So let's say you have a TV, but you want another TV. So it's a real luxury. Put it in your basement for your teenage kids so they're not making a ruckus upstairs. Now the TV is 300 bucks, but there's 2% deflation. So the choice is, do I buy the TV today for 300, or do I wait 12 months and save myself $6 and buy it for $294? You're buying it today. You're not going to wait 12 months to save $6, right? But that's what the central banks will tell you. And that's what they've convinced politicians of. And so they will print money to make sure that productivity improvements doesn't result in lower prices for consumers. I mean, it should be considered an awesome thing that we're all getting to purchase things at cheaper prices every year, and each generation is going to get wealthier and wealthier. That's the way it's supposed to work. We should be so proud of that. But it's not happening. And I mean, every generation up until now in the modern era has been better off in spite of central banks printing money, not because of, in spite of. But this is the first time in modern history that the next generation will not be better off than the one that preceded it. And it's inflation, but a big part of it is the housing affordability crisis.
Yes.
That is particularly, I mean, you think it's bad in the States. It's terrible up here in Canada. It's terrible in Australia. I mean, younger people, first-time home buyers, the average age is significantly higher than it was just 20 years ago, 30
40.
years ago.
It's up to 40
But
now.
yeah, yeah, it's ridiculous. And it's so unfair. And maybe I'll You want me to talk a little bit about housing, why that's
Yeah,
unfair? And
absolutely.
yeah,
You read my mind. That was gonna be, my next question was
okay.
I was gonna go into housing. I was just talking with my mom and her husband the other day, and they're at the point now where they've got a 13-year-old, and they're planning on him living at home until he's 25 to 30 because it's unfair to push him out of the house and require him to rent some room in some stranger's home where he's spending a decent portion of the money that he's capable of making and not able to put that towards buying a new home. And at the same time, like they're older parents, like they're in their early 60s. It's like, the kid's 13. It might be smarter just to let him stay in their granny unit until they pass and are able to give him the house because it's 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 so unfair. So yeah, please touch on that.
Okay, okay, yeah, so it sounds like your parents are, same generation as me, I'm 63. And, the trouble with housing is that, in terms of, like, starting a business or in terms of investing in the stock market, that's a choice that you can make, and it's a choice you can decide not to make, right? You don't have a choice in needing a place to live. This should not be, um, exposed to the same sorts of free market rules, if you will. Well, it's not a free market. If it was, we wouldn't be in trouble.
Yeah.
But anyway, so remember earlier we were talking about creating capital. And the only way that you should benefit in this free market capitalist system is if you've created capital that somebody else wanted and they freely exchanged their capital with your capital. So all the capital that you have, your accumulated wealth that you have, should be a reflection of the capital that you created over your lifetime and freely exchange with other people. So you've got their capital. Maybe somebody built a house or somebody built a car, you have all that. The only reason you have it is because you also created capital and there was a fair exchange of that capital. Nobody else's expense. So now on to housing. So we live in a suburb of Toronto. We bought our house in 2001, which was just when the central bank wealth effect policies really kicked into gear, which we can talk specifically about in a second, which was their goal was to drive asset prices higher. And so our house went up 4 times from where we bought it. Now there's inflation there as well. In real terms, adjusted for inflation, it's up about 2.5 times. So we have obtained, if we sell our house, we obtain wealth 4 times what we paid for the house. What was our contribution to society to justify making 4 times on our home? Did we create 4 times the amount of capital? No. Our house is not a productive asset. It's not producing 4 times as much stuff, not producing 4 times as much capital. It hasn't expanded 4 times in size. So now the capital is 4 times larger than it was when we bought it. It hasn't relocated to an oceanfront view. So it's a different location. But no, it's the same economic good that a young couple or a newcomer to our country has to pay 4 times what we paid for the same economic good. So what it is a redistribution of wealth within society. It's not creation of wealth, redistribution of wealth from a young couple's bank account and into our bank account. And when you're looking down at society, there's not 4 times as much capital. It's just the same house. And so we benefit at somebody else's expense. And that is not the way the economy is supposed to work. But this is the result of wealth effect policies by central banks. And they affected this by driving interest rates down to zero. As I said earlier, sort of sacrificing the main street on the altar of higher asset prices. Take interest rates down. They took interest rates down to 1%, I believe it was, in '02 and '03, despite the fact that the economy was still growing. This was unprecedented. because it was about driving asset prices higher artificially. And and when they do this, when they distort the interest rate lower, it takes it further and further below what's called the natural rate of interest. So the natural rate of interest is determined by people like you, me, anybody with capital making a risk return assessment about who should I lend my money to and what sort of risk are they? And so what sort of interest should I charge them? Or how much should a corporation charge or pay you interest? And so when you've got millions of people making these risk return assessments, it results in a natural rate of interest for the market that results in the most efficient allocation of capital. And it's the most efficient allocation of capital because those making the decisions are the ones with skin in the game. It's their own capital. They are going to be the most careful and they're going to suffer the consequences or reap the rewards. So you end up with this natural rate results in the most productive economy. Central banks instead target what's called a neutral rate. A neutral rate is what encourages just enough debt fueled consumption to keep spending growing without causing inflation to go higher than 2%. But when it's debt fueled consumption, people take on debt and they spend it, and that boosts GDP. So policymakers think that's great. But then people can't service any more debt, like they're tapped out. So central bank lowers interest rates so they can service even more debt and spend. Oh, it looks like it worked. But then they can't afford any more debt again, so they have to lower. So they keep lowering interest rates. And they keep saying they're baffled that the neutral rate of interest over the last 20, 30 years is steadily ground lower and lower. Well, it's because the debt pile is growing higher and higher, and it's reducing people's ability to spend based on taking on more debt. The trouble is that their natural rate is up here, and the further they take the neutral rate down here, further away it is from the natural rate, which results in the best economy. And you have seen productivity growth grinding lower in developed economies for decades. There's the odd hiccup and good hiccup, like the dot-com internet stuff in the 90s had increased productivity growth. And you may get increased productivity growth from AI over the next 10, 15 years. But let's say it does result in increased productivity growth. It's still going to be much lower than it otherwise would have been if they hadn't been increasing the money supply so quickly and distorted interest rates far below the natural rate. And so my wife and I, we're not planning on selling our home. But if we did, we would make a lot of money at somebody else's expense. Now we're just going to give that. We have three daughters. We're just going to give that money to our girls so they can afford to buy an overly priced home.
Yeah.
But I would much prefer my home price to go back to where it was when we bought it. We've built up equity in our home by paying down our mortgage, and that's the way it's supposed to work,
Yeah.
right? It's like a forced saving. When you have a mortgage, you have no choice. You've got to make that monthly payment. But part of that payment is like a forced savings plan. You're building up equity in your home. And then back in the day, people would have mortgage burning parties and you'd burn the piece of paper that said you owed the bank, you don't owe them anymore, and everybody's happy. And now you've got that nest egg that you built up in your home. But that's real capital that you produced over the life of your career and then paid off the bank. And so you could, let's say you're again, say your buddy making bikes, he buys a home and he's selling his bikes and he's able to pay off the mortgage. Let's say the house is worth 300,000 bucks or whatever. He's got no mortgage. Effectively, what he has is $300,000 worth of bikes stored up in the house. That's what gave him
Yeah.
the wherewithal to buy that house.
Yep.
That, and it didn't come at anybody else's expense. That's the way it's supposed to work. These days, with central banks distorting interest rates much lower than they should be to explicitly drive asset prices higher. Again, this is not a conspiracy theory. And Bernanke, who was head of the Fed from '06, I think it was, to something like 2013. I mean, he regularly talked about the portfolio effect of quantitative easing, of printing money, and
Yeah.
how it worked, and how it sort of trickled through financial markets, eventually getting to equities and driving stock markets higher. He thought it was a good thing. No. If stock markets are growing higher because companies are taking savings from people, capital, and putting it to productive use, and innovation and R&D and coming up with better and better products to wow their customers, and their customers willingly part with their capital to buy those products, then that company's profit starts to rise. Company starts to make more money. They can hire more people. They can pay them more. The share price goes up because the profit's going up. And then if a whole bunch of companies in the stock market are all increasing their capital, their share prices are going up, that pushes the stock market higher. So a rising stock market, if it's reflective of all the capital that's being produced in the economy at nobody else's expense, then that's a really good thing. That's a really good wealth effect. It's a real, true wealth effect. But if stock markets are rising not because companies are producing more capital, but because the central bank took interest rates down to zero to boost the valuations of stocks, or started printing money to boost the valuations of stocks, then there's no excess capital being produced. There, again, I don't think it's a conspiracy theory. I don't think they were trying to enrich the top 1%. I think, is my opinion, that they truly believed that by driving asset prices higher, rather than have the economy grow and push stock markets higher, they decided to push the stock market higher to try and pull the economy up with it, assuming that all the benefits of pushing stocks higher would trickle down to everybody else. It didn't happen. And it's not going to happen. And it's not sustainable, by the way. You know, the path that we're on, the math is already getting to the point where it's very difficult and doesn't work for a lot of people. And it's going to not work for an increasing amount of people as time goes on. And then it ends. And we can choose how we want it to end by dealing with it head on, which would be very uncomfortable, or we can stick our head in the sand and assume and hope that everything will work out. Something will come out of left field and save the day and blah, blah. It's not going to
Yeah,
happen.
no. I mean, they're putting Band-Aids on bullet wounds, you know?
Yeah, no,
It's
exactly.
and the
Exactly.
thing about real estate too is it's like not only is your house not worth 4 times more than it was the day that you bought it, it's worth less because
Yeah,
of the
that's right.
first law of thermodynamics. Things break down, entropy, right? Like my
Yeah,
house right now, it was built in 1999. I need to replace some roof tiles, I need to replace some siding, but it's worth 50%, twice what I paid for it.
yeah,
And that makes no sense economically, right? There's very few industries where something that is in worse shape the day that the day you're in it than the day you bought it is worth more than the day you bought it. Like that doesn't make any sense. And like I think that we're also running into, my entire Twitter feed right now is different data points about, horrible aspects of the economy. One of the, a big one right now is the auto industry. Like vehicles should be getting cheaper. The same as we were talking about bikes. Like they're so much easier to make, but at the same time, the companies are using cheaper materials. They're because of all of the regulations, they're doing things to these vehicles to make them more fuel efficient and cleaner burning that is actually bad for the vehicle, so they're not lasting as long as they did before, right? Like, the materials are all cheaper. You've got brand new people who own brand new cars who are having problems with frames rotting out, with transmissions going bad. You've got, like, Honda makes a vehicle right now that they don't even make parts for the transmission. If your transmission goes and it's not a good transmission, you have to buy a completely new transmission. You can't just have a
yeah.
mechanic rebuild it like you were able to when me and you were young. Like, I have a 72 C10 pickup in my garage that I just built a new engine for a couple of grand. If you bought a
Wow.
brand new Chevy pickup and had to, build a new engine for it, you're looking at like 10 to 12 grand. So I think
Wow.
that's another area where we're going to have a serious problem. Like again, people need a vehicle. They need to be able to I mean, I guess you could argue that, like, there's public transportation, but for a lot of people, public transportation just isn't really an option. Like, here in Idaho, public transportation is not great. Time is money, and you're gonna spend a ton of your time, going on public transportation rather than buying a new vehicle. And, like, I think a lot of the productivity growth within the economy is fake in a lot of ways. It's, the master builder example from Ludwig von Mises, where,
Mm.
you've got this master builder who's given all of these materials. He's given a materials list for the job that he needs. And by the end of the job, he realizes he doesn't have enough materials to finish the job. So to the outside eye, it looks like a lot of things are happening. People are moving around, stuff is going up. You're seeing a change within the building that he's building. But in the end, not only did the building not get finished, but everything that was done was for nothing. It was all fake. It was just smoke and mirrors. And I think like a lot of that is service industry jobs. You've got people who are driving, doing Uber Eats, which I swore after during the pandemic, I was like, this is not gonna last. People don't have the disposable income to have food delivered to them 3 times a day, but for some reason, like, that job is still holding on. You've got other jobs that, shouldn't really exist or should be, drastically reduced because people don't have the money to pay for the services that are rendered, and I think that, like, that can go when you talk about the jobs report being off by 90 million jobs, like, there's a lot of those jobs are second jobs. A lot of those jobs are jobs that aren't really doing anything for the economy. They're luxury jobs, and, you know, it's hard to look at all of these different data points throughout the economy and not think that we're gonna have a head-on collision with a brick wall in the near future. Like, it seems to me that, and it's not if, it's when and how bad, essentially. And I think that date of when is coming sooner and sooner. And to be honest, it terrifies me for the younger generation. Like, I live here in Idaho. I grew up in Northern California. When I got hurt on a wage that I was making in North Dakota. I couldn't afford to buy a home or rent a home in the area that I grew up in. So I moved to Idaho, and now I'm renting out rooms in my home to younger kids who are going through the same thing that I went through. In Northern California, rich people from out of state moved in, drove up real estate prices, and priced out the local generation, younger generation. And that's the same thing is happening here since COVID. People moved here because California went to shit, for lack of a better term, and they wanted to come and have a better life. But in the meantime, they made it harder and harder for the local younger generation that grew up here. And with the economic illiteracy in this country, people aren't setting themselves up for the crash because they're under the impression that things are going to be great, especially when you've got like, I one of the few things that the two-party system in America differs on is economics. They're both gonna print money, they're both gonna do what they're gonna do, but you've got a large, portion of the population right now who thinks that Trump can do no wrong and that the economy is gonna be great just because he's a businessman, where to me, he's shown no economic literacy whatsoever. Like, I'm not sure that he even understands what inflation actually is. So they're not preparing for the rainy day. They're not preparing for the crash. And, you know, I I really, really hope that it's not as bad as I think it's gonna be, but I sure think it's gonna be bad.
Well, I agree, like, if we don't do anything about it. And, I'll make a couple of comments on what you some of the stuff you just said there. When you talk about a car, you know, for a lot of people, it is a necessity. You don't have any choice. And I remember during the housing crisis in the US back in '07, '08, '09, that people were defaulting on their mortgage before they would default on their car loan. And their rationale was that I can sleep in my car, but I can't drive my house,
Yeah.
you know? And I mean, it's terrible that people have to make those kinds of decisions in the first place. The other thing I would say is, I mean, it's exactly to your point that the problems that we are encountering transcend politics. So it's not about left versus well, it's not about center or just left of center, just right of center politics. They both do the same thing,
Yeah.
and and the average person, they understand that life is getting more difficult. Your buddy, who he can't start his own business, is just too tough. So they know they're getting screwed, but they don't know how. And then I mean, it's natural to look for someone to blame because it's not their fault. So it must be somebody else's fault. And it is, but I think they end up blaming the wrong people. And it's very natural then for Democrats just to blame
Yep.
Republicans and Republicans just to blame Democrats. And we have a place down in Florida. And so we've got a lot of friends who are Democrats, a lot of friends who are Republicans, and they're all beautiful people. And for the most part, they all believe in the same sort of thing. They all believe in, helping people out. They all believe in law and order. They all believe in, you know, it- but then as soon as you bring politics into it, it becomes like a party and then they hate each other. Like
Yeah.
it's so sad. It's to watch this happen, and it's starting to happen up in Canada as well, and in other countries. And maybe naively, I do believe this is a result of a lack of understanding with respect to how you're getting screwed. But one other thing I'll mention that you talked about in terms of car prices and that they should be coming down. Absolutely. For the same quality car, absolutely. Even for better quality cars, they should be coming down. Now, I use a specific example in my book. And again, my book goes step by step. I use analogies, I use very easy to understand language. So the average person, if they read it, they will understand what's going on. So I have two chapters on inflation, what causes it, and the other chapter is called Inflation Much Higher Than You Think. And because the government will use uh, a couple of techniques to make the inflation appear lower than it really is. So one of them is called substitution. So if you are eating a certain type of steak and it
Yep.
gets too expensive, and so then you'll switch to a lower quality meat, then they will look at the price increase of the lower quality meat as inflation, not the one that you're reading before. But your life now, your lifestyle has been negatively impacted. You're not able to purchase the type of steak that you wanted to purchase. You had to trade down a bit. That was a real impact on your life, but it's not captured in the inflation numbers through substitution. The other thing that they do is something called hedonic adjustments. And I use the car example in my book. So if, let's say, a Honda Civic goes up in price by 5%, let's say, next year, the government will look at that Honda Civic and they will look at changes made to that Honda Civic. And if they think that that Honda Civic, because of technology improvements, better brakes or whatever, cameras, that it's actually 7% better than it was the prior year, even though it's 5% more in terms of price, they will say that it fell in price 2% because it's 7%. You're getting
Yeah.
7% more product for this for that 5% higher price. So they're saying that the price has gone down 2%. So for I looked at the top five cars, I think it was, selling from 1996 to 2008. And in that 12-year period, the average price rose about 50%, right? But the quality of the cars was improving. And so the government kept adjusting the price down. So they have the price of cars falling over that 12-year period rather than rising 50%. So the government tells you that cars are cheaper than they were 12 years ago, but you can no longer afford one. And so people They know that it doesn't make any sense. They just can't piece it all
Yeah.
together. And again, I believe the bureaucrats and policymakers think they're doing the right thing. They've convinced themselves. It's easier to delude yourself into thinking you're doing the right thing so you can make the easy decisions rather than the tough decisions. Nobody wants to be that one, the bearer of bad news. Look, I'm sorry to tell you that not only are we living well beyond our means, but we've been doing it for many, many years.
And it's
Be-
also a problem that these people have to get reelected. So if they're making a decision that negatively impacts their constituents, they run a lesser chance of getting reelected. So it's not like they can just go to them and say, "Hey, look, like we need to teach you about economics," because most people have jobs. They don't have time to learn about this stuff. They don't, a lot of them do have the time. They don't have the desire. I think football is far too popular in this
Yeah,
country, for
yeah.
people's own good. But, like, there's very few of these politicians who are actually capable of being honest with their constituents because they're worried about getting reelected, and, like, you know,
Yeah.
a lot of times there's only a couple of these politicians that I think, like, actually get economics. I think Rand Paul is one, I think Thomas Massey is another. Uh, I'd be hard pressed to name another one that actually, like, gets what we're actually going through, and
Well, they might get it, but they just won't admit it.
yeah,
Right.
and unfortunately, like, I was listening to an interview with Rand Paul the other day, and he was talking about the middle class, and he was saying, like, "Hey, people tell me all the time that the middle class is shrinking, but the reality is that there's, whatever the number was, 5% more middle class Americans today than there was 30 years ago." And it's like, "Yeah, Rand, but the purchasing power of the middle class has gone down drastically." So, like, there's always going to be a middle class if you're just doing purely mathematical, formulations of the median portion of the economic, sector. But, like,
Sure.
it's impossible to say that the middle class is larger than it was 30 years ago when the purchasing power is nowhere near what it was. At this point, like, middle class Americans are having a hard time buying a house and a car, which is
Yeah.
something like my mother bought a house when she was in high school.
Is that
In
right?
high school, she was 17. She got a lower interest rate for being a first-time home buyer, and her first house cost like $60,000. Good
Wow.
luck buying a
Yeah.
house while you're in high school today, unless your parents are buying it for you.
No, no, exactly. No, no, it's very frustrating. But again, that's why I've written a book. There's a saying that the people always get the government that they deserve. But
Yep.
that's only true if the people really and truly understand what's going on and can then vote accordingly and demand accordingly. And people don't really understand what's going on, but it's not their fault. And thus my book, empowering very smart people such as yourself and your buddy and entrepreneurs and employees of large companies, whatever. The average person is very smart.
I agree.
And but policymakers, they don't, for better or for worse, they've convinced themselves that only they are capable of making the decisions that is in our own best interest. It's not true. So when if you can empower people with truth and knowledge and understanding of what's really going on, then the people will rise up and demand that our governments do something different. And then it won't be political suicide to say that, yes, we have been living beyond our means. Let's all look at this together rather than demonizing just one part of society. Let's all get together and figure out a way out of this. How are we going to do this together? There's going to be shared pain for everybody. And America is an amazing country when it comes to stuff like that. You know, people can come together, and Americans can do anything, but they'll only willingly do it if they believe it's real and it's true, and they trust the fact that it's not just them that's going to pay the consequences, that we're all going to be in this together. Rather, now I'm going to suffer, but these other guys over here are going to make out like bandits, right? People don't trust the system anymore.
And they
And
shouldn't.
so we got to get back to that, you know?
Yeah. Alrighty, we're coming up on an hour. I don't want to keep you all day. So if there's anything major, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot major that we left out, but if there's anything major that you'd like to get off your chest before we get out of here, and then let people know where they can buy your book, um, and
Yeah, yeah.
we'll
Thanks,
call it.
Nick. Yeah. Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. No, I don't think so. Probably something I'll think of after we
Oh, there's always
uh
something that I think of, like,
yeah.
there's
Yeah.
there's just so much, there's so
No,
many
no,
data
there is.
points.
But I
There's
think we hit on the core issues. Um or maybe I'll just finish off by re-emphasizing that I really don't think that it's a conspiracy theory. Now, it might be, right? Maybe I just don't know. But it doesn't have to be a conspiracy theory for you to be angry about what has happened in a direction that we have gone in. And so my book, I make every attempt possible to not make it about politics, to not make it a book about uh, you know, uh, uh, calling people out. It's not a book about retribution. I guess that's what I would say. And and yeah, so hopefully people will pick up the book, and I also have a blog. So where they can find me is my book is called no, my book is called Capital Offense: Why Some Benefit at Your Expense. It's available online. Um, And I also have a blog called Political Economy. Instead of political, it's Paul, my name, Paul, Political Economy. And it's free, it goes out every week. And again, I try to keep things in very easy to understand language, have some fun with it. So we just look at, what's going on with certain companies, look back at a company's history, um, what's going on like with inflation, and just sort of try and distill things for in sort of sound bites that people can get a real sense of what's happening in the economy without having to read a whole bunch of stuff. And so people can sign up for that for free. Just have to put your email in. It's on my website, which is Paddington Capital MGMT.com. And so I've got all my posts going back last few years there. I've got podcast interviews, I got book review stuff like that, and then on the social media stuff, I'm at Paddington Cap. So Paddington and then CAP. That'd be like Instagram and LinkedIn and X and stuff like that.
Sounds good, Paul. I'll have all of that in the description of the podcast. So anybody who is interested in subscribing to the newsletter, buying the book, maybe employing your capital company, they can just click right into the description and give you a shout. It was a pleasure talking with you, Paul, and hopefully we can do this again sometime down the road. And you know, hopefully it's not after a major economic crash, but
Yeah,
something
hopefully
tells
not.
me that that's going to be the case at some point. So,
Yeah, well, hopefully we'll all be prepared for it.
yeah, well, not all of us, but at least the ones that are open to hearing about the problems and learning about the solutions. And
Exactly.
that would
Well, thank
be, my main, you know, kind of piece of advice to people is take this stuff seriously. Don't
yeah,
listen to the people in Washington or on, the news telling you how great things are. This is only a matter of time and you got to set yourself up. Like we said earlier in the podcast, this is going to be great for asset holders and terrible for everyone else. Don't be
yeah,
everyone else.
yeah, yeah. Well, good for you, Nick, for trying to help people out.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks for listening and we'll talk to you later.